Of all the technical questions that haunt a new creator, this one is at the top of the list. What frame rate and resolution should I use for YouTube? You've crafted your script, lit your scene, and poured your energy into filming. The last thing you want is for all that effort to be lost to a blurry, jittery upload. Let's demystify it. Think of these settings as the foundation of your video's visual house. You need to build it right from the ground up. First, let's talk about resolution, the sheer number of pixels that make up your image. This is your video's clarity, its sharpness. As of 2024 and beyond, your absolute minimum should be 1080p, Full HD. It's the standard, the baseline that viewers expect. But if your camera and editing software can handle it, you should absolutely be aiming for 1440p, Quad HD, or 4K. We ask ourselves, why shoot in 4K if YouTube will compress it anyway? It's not just about bragging rights. Recording in a higher resolution gives you priceless flexibility in editing. You can zoom in on a shot, crop a frame to recompose it, or stabilize a shaky clip without instantly sacrificing all your image quality. It's like having a digital safety net. When you export and YouTube does its compression magic, that 4K file downsized to 1080p will almost always look crisper and more detailed than a native 1080p file. You ask, what about the frame rate? The number of individual frames shown per second. This isn't about sharpness, but about motion and feel. Your choice here is an artistic one as much as a technical one. For most content, vlogs, tutorials, tech reviews, talking heads, 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second is your golden zone. 24 frames per second, technical 23.976 frames per second is the cinematic look. This is the standard frame rate used for Hollywood movies and primetime TV dramas for decades. The vibe is filmic, artistic, serious, narrative, and it's softer. Why does this work? Because there are a few frames per second, there is more natural motion blur between frames. To the human eye, this feels more story-like and less like reality. 24 frames per second is best for cinematic travel vlogs. Think Peter McKinnon or Sam Calder styles. Short films and narrative sketches. Also, music videos. High-end production B-roll, where you want it to look lush and expensive. But warning, remember, if you pan the camera too quickly at 24 frames per second, the footage will look stuttery or choppy. 30 frames per second, technically 29.97 frames per second, is the standard or broadcast look. This is the standard for North American broadcast television, news, sitcoms, and reality TV, and has become the default safe option for most web content. The vibe is realistic, approachable, and clear. Well, why does 30 frames per second work? It is noticeably crisper than 24 frames per second and has less motion blur, making it easier to see details, but it isn't hyper smooth like 60 frames per second. It feels like real life rather than a movie. 30 frames per second is best for talking head videos, tutorials, and commentary channels. Also, educational content, standard daily vlogging, and live streaming, usually the standard for Twitch or YouTube Live. If you don't know what to pick, start with 30 frames per second. It's the most versatile. Then there's 60 frames per second and higher, the action and gaming look. This frame rate captures twice as much information per second as standard videos. The vibe is hyper-realistic, buttery smooth, intense, and fast. Why does this work? It eliminates almost all motion blur. You can see every detail of fast-moving object. When applied to regular footage, like someone just talking, 60 frames per second can feel too real, sometimes described as the soap opera effect. It can make high-quality footage look cheap if not used correctly. 60 frames per second is best used for gaming. This is a mandatory for gaming channels. Gamers play at 60 frames per second or higher, so the video should match. Sports and action filming, like skateboarding, football, or racing. And tech reviews, showing how smooth a phone screen scrolls, looks better in 60 frames per second. And let's not forget about slow motion. If you record at 60 frames per second, you can slow the footage down by 50% in a 30 frames per second timeline for high quality slow motion. And finally, export smartly. If you filmed in 4K 24 frames per second, export in 4K 24 frames per second. If you filmed a mix, export your final edit at the resolution of your best footage and the frame rate you used for the majority of your project. Remember, consistency is key. Stop seeing these settings as a daunting exam. See them as your creative toolkit. Choose 4K for its sharpness and flexibility. Choose 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second for its natural feel. Choose 60 frames per second for its slow motion power. You don't need a PhD in video engineering to make great YouTube content. Pick a resolution that matches your gear and audience. Choose a frame rate that suits your video speed, and you will be ready to wow viewers without the headaches of endless render times. Thanks for watching. I will see you all on the next one. Frame rates, resolution.